October last year, I drove my 2017 Chevrolet Bolt Premier all the way from Portland, Oregon to Los Angeles and back to attend the official reveal of this car, the new 2027 Chevrolet Bolt EV. And a couple of weeks ago, we got an email from GM asking us if we'd like to come to the official drive event for the same vehicle. But between the October launch and now, GM has all but confirmed that this car is not going to be made in large volumes, it's going to be disappearing really soon, and it's left a lot of people, including me, with a bad taste in their mouth about how long this vehicle is going to be around and if it is really worth spending money on. But coming in at the most affordable price point in the market now for any EV in North America, that is, until Chinese EVs start going on sale in Canada, this car is one that we can't ignore. It's built on a familiar old design. It's basically an old Bolt EUV from the outside, but underneath everything is new. Chassis tweaks, battery pack, drivetrain, and interior. They've all been given a refresh. And today we're going to find out if those refreshes work, or if this just is some kind of nostalgia trip to keep EV fans happy for just a little bit longer before all EVs become historical relics, as if GM would cancel EVs something. Let's find out. Well, hello from Malibu Beach. It is a beautiful early spring morning here in Southern California. And the first thing I want to say about this particular drive event is the fact that when EVs were still relatively new to mainstream automakers, think 10 years ago, a lot of media test drives were in places that were flat, or places that were very picturesque but didn't necessarily have a huge amount of elevation changes. And when they did have huge elevation changes, there were kind of mandatory charging stops because a lot of the EVs had very limited range, and when driven by enthusiastic automotive journalists with heavy right feet, that meant that vehicles ran very low on their state of charge, and the poor press teams spent a lot of their evenings charging the vehicles back up. For this particular drive event, however, GM purposely didn't charge the vehicles up overnight because this afternoon another wave of journalists are going to be arriving, and they will be doing the same thing that we did yesterday, which was take cars up over other roads in the area and also experience the DC fast charging experience, because it's remarkably different for this Bolt than the original Bolt. So that makes me smile, because it shows that EVs have come so far that it's no longer a requirement that press drives start with vehicles with full battery packs. And we were told, yeah, you're probably going to get back to the hotel with like 20% state of charge, and that's on purpose so that we can demonstrate fast charging. So let's talk about this particular car and where it fits into the marketplace. Obviously, the original Bolt EV was made from 2017 through until 2020. Then it got a facelift, and then it was made until 2022. And in 2020, GM decided to introduce the Bolt EUV, which was basically the original Bolt with a few tweaks here and there, slightly larger, slightly heavier, but the same 60 kilowatt hour NMC battery pack and the same 150 kilowatt motor. And what that original heavier Bolt EUV offered was effectively a slightly more boring driving experience than the Bolt EV, because it was heavier, it had the same motor and battery pack, so it just felt a little more wallowy, a little less fun. Those two vehicles were cancelled, GM stopped making them, and then the way that GM tells it, and I'll let you decide exactly what happened behind the scenes, GM said, you know, people really like this car. They want us to bring it back. GM said, it didn't have another vehicle that was ready for that market segment, so it decided instead to bring the Bolt EUV back, but with a new battery pack, a new drivetrain, new underpinnings, and a little bit more of the spirit of the original. And I think that's what we have here. So externally, if you look at this car, it looks like the Bolt EUV. From a distance, it's very difficult to tell the two cars apart. But inside, it's much more Bolt-esque, both in terms of how it feels in the cabin, but also in the way that it drives. And that's been down to a dramatic change in basically everything, I want to say under the hood, but you know what I'm talking about. The chassis, the battery pack, the drivetrain, the power electronics, all of that good stuff. So the original Bolt had a 60 kilowatt hour NMC battery pack. This Bolt has a 65 kilowatt hour LFP battery pack. Now that's good for multiple reasons. LFP battery chemistry is cheaper, it's more durable, and it's generally used by most in the auto industry now in preference to NMC, unless you're building a balls to the wall performance demon, in which case NMC still wins out. But NMC cells also contain cobalt and nickel. The mining of those materials is questionable from an ethical standpoint. So if you want to have a car that doesn't have any nickel or cobalt in, this is a great choice. Obviously, LFP packs are becoming the norm across the whole industry at this price point. So in addition to getting 5 kilowatt hours of extra battery capacity, this Bolt also gets the X76 front-wheel drive motor from the Chevrolet Equinox EV. It has an 11.59 to 1 drive ratio, and it's really well tuned to the Bolt. On paper, GM says that in the Bolt, that motor has less torque, but in terms of at the wheels power, it's actually slightly better than the Equinox EV, and it also improves the sprint time of this car over the original Bolt. So the original Bolt was about 7-ish seconds. This one is closer to 6.8, maybe a little bit less depending on how you drive it. And it's just a really well thought out, well engineered combination of battery pack, drivetrain and power electronics. Importantly also, for this vehicle, which as I've noted is limited production, and I'll come to that bugbear later on in the video, you have a really good marriage of the different systems that GM currently makes smushed into this car, and not smushed in a bad way. I'm not implying that GM didn't take any care over it, because actually it took a lot of care over it. So the Bolt EV benefits from all of the other EVs in GM's lineup. So the power electronics, the drivetrain, as I've already mentioned, all of the in-car infotainment systems, all of the switchgear, they all come from other GM products. And at this morning's briefing, before we departed on our drive, we were told that the majority of components in this vehicle are either repurposed or new. And repurposed meaning they come from another GM vehicle and they've been put in this car, sometimes with tweaks, sometimes in effectively a stock configuration. And while the external panels are basically identical to what you'd find in a Bolt EUV from 22 to 23, 24, under the hood, everything is very different, even to the subframe at the front of the vehicle, which has been completely redesigned and rebuilt. If you open the hood on this car, you'll notice that the underhood area has a very different layout. I was actually joking with one of the engineering team earlier on, while there isn't a front trunk in the Bolt, I think someone with enough ingenuity could actually 3D model and make a front trunk for this car. I would love to see it. The hint I got from GM's engineers was, yeah, that would be cool. Whether that is officially sanctioned or not remains to be seen. But one thing that is notably different is the elimination of the Regen on demand pedal. The original Bolt had a very nice paddle on the left-hand side of the steering wheel that you could use to add a little bit of extra regenerative braking when you wanted to slow you down a little bit faster without touching the brake pedal. Now, I am a fan of Regen on-demand paddles. I own and regularly drive a 2017 Chevrolet Bolt Premier, and I basically leave that button depressed most of the time when I'm driving. It allows me to one pedal drive my car in pretty much every environment that I have come across, so much so, in fact, that the the brakes on my Bolts are a little bit rusty because I don't use them very much, and I do have to go out and regularly clean them, if you know what I'm talking about. In this car, GM has moved all of the Regen controls to the center touchscreen display. At the top of the dash here, there is a button that allows you to turn on Regen, and you can tweak exactly how much regenerative braking you want to apply. I've got it set to the harshest setting, and it's possible to bring the car to a complete standstill using that Regen on demand feature. You're probably seeing some video right now of us doing a test of that earlier today. And when it gets to 0, which it actually does, as opposed to the Leaf, which never actually gets there, it does also apply an auto hold brake, which means, you know, you're not going to suddenly roll away or anything like that if you're on a slight incline. I will admit, though, that the jury is a little bit out on the Regen pedal settings. I still prefer the tactility and usability of the Regen on-demand button, and this is the first GM EV, I believe, in nearly 10 years that hasn't featured that as default. That said, I don't think that the absence of the paddle is going to be a game changer or a deal breaker for anyone, because I think after a few hundred miles you'd get used to the regenerative braking on liftoff that this car offers. You're also going to get used to the new blended braking system that GM is very proud of, and the reason why that regenerative braking on-demand paddle has been eliminated. Basically, GM has retweaked the entire braking system so that when you press the physical brake pedal, the car will intelligently decide whether it needs to use regenerative braking or whether it needs to use friction braking. Now, the previous Bolt did that. It's fairly standard across EVs, but GM claims it's now improved that decision-making process, and that allows the vehicle to be far more efficient in terms of how much energy it recaptures on liftoff. One of the anecdotes that GM's engineering team told me this morning is that regardless of if you drive with one pedal driving engaged or disabled, you should get the same type of average efficiency per kilowatt hour regardless. But where I find the Bolt EV really shines is its tight turning circle and responsive steering. On these little switchbacks that are coming up, it's just going to do the job without too much fuss. I don't have to feed in ridiculously large amounts of steering wheel input to get the car to go around. And importantly, you can really modulate how the car tucks in with your right foot, which is a good sign of how well the drivetrain is set up. Unlike some of the other Chevy EVs that we've driven of late, which would just feel terrifying on a small twisty road like this, this actually gives impeccable feedback. I know exactly where all of the wheels are. I know where the suspension is loaded and where it's unloading, and that makes the driving experience much more pleasant. Of course, it would be remiss for me to do a review of this car and not talk about the LFP Battery Pack, because that LFP Battery Pack really allows this vehicle to outperform the Bolt EV and the Bolt EUV from previous model years. Being LFP, it can charge more effectively at higher speeds. GM says on paper it has a maximum DC fast charging rate of 150 kilowatts, but I understand yesterday someone saw 157 kilowatts for a brief while at a fast charging station. And I think it's important here to note that theoretical maximum charge currents can sometimes be exceeded by a vehicle if the batteries are in just the right condition, the right state of charge, the weather is perfect, etc., etc. With Bolt, what you have is preconditioning tied to the car's Android Automotive in-car dash system. I'll talk to you a bit about that in a moment, that will automatically precondition the battery if you're heading to a fast charger. And GM says it's going to turn on the preconditioning so that it's at the optimum temperature when you pull up and plug in. For this model year, as you probably know, the Bolt comes with NACS as standard. That's a North American charge system. That's the Tesla supercharger connector. And that is going to be standard for this model year. However, you can also use a CCS Type 1 charging station if you buy GM's appropriate NACS to CCS charging adapter. Importantly, that is different to the NACS to J1772 adapter. So if you already have an EV, you already have an EV charging station, a J1772 charging station at home, you will need to buy two adapters if you want to make use of non-Tesla infrastructure. You'll need to buy a NACS to J1772 adapter to allow you to charge at up to 11.5 kilowatts from a compatible level 2 charging station. And then you'll also need to buy a NACS to CCS adapter, which will allow you to fast charge. We tested out both supercharging and CCS fast charging yesterday. GM wanted us to go to a local Tesla supercharger, which we did, and then we ended up also going to an Electrify America charging station because we wanted to make sure that the charging station actually did give a similar experience between CCS Type 1 and supercharger. Unfortunately, the car was much fuller when we got to the Electrify America charging station than it had been when we pulled up at the Tesla supercharger. So we didn't see the same 150 kilowatts max power delivered to the battery, but I can tell you at one point I glanced down at the gauge on the charging station. It said it was delivering 65, 66 kilowatts of power, and the battery pack was at about 70% state of charge, which is respectable. It's not gonna break any records, but it's respectable. And GM's official figures suggest we should see a 20 to 80% state of charge happen in about 20 minutes at a suitably powerful supercharger or NACS compatible charging station. In addition to all of that fast charging goodness, 150 kilowatts is a dramatic improvement on the 55 kilowatt max of the original Bolt EV and EUV. And by the way, anyone with a Bolt will tell you as soon as those vehicles hit like 50, 60% state of charge, they ramp down to 18 kilowatts. And if it's a cold day, you're not going to see much more than about 25, regardless of the state of charge of the battery, because the battery's not warm enough to take that 55 kilowatts. You have reliable, usable fast charging in the new Bolt. At the moment, however, if you want to turn up at a Tesla supercharger and use the Bolt to supercharge, you have to go into the center touchscreen display and use the app that is installed by default in your vehicle that allows you to then tell the Bolt, hey, I am at this Tesla supercharger, I wish to use this stall, and then it will communicate with Tesla's backend and initiate charging. GM tells me that plug and charge for superchargers is in the pipeline and will be delivered via an OTA, an over-the-air software update, in the near future. But for right now, you do have to use the center touchscreen or a smartphone app to activate charging. Also worthy of note is the fact that Bolt comes from the factory with bidirectional power transfer as standard. It also has the ability to offer vehicle to home connectivity. Now, you do have to buy the GM home energy setup and have that installed at your home. Interestingly though, and I believe GM is the only company doing this, in addition to being able to lease the car, you can also lease the home system. So if you are worried about the costs associated with having a home backup system, you can actually pay and have that installed and rent it or lease it. And then when you get rid of your car, presumably GM will come and remove it for a nominal fee. I don't know the full details about it, and I haven't been able to get around to the person involved with that, because obviously this is a big event and there's lots of things happening, but I'm sure we'll be able to share more information soon. I have spent a lot of time talking about how this car is really comparable to the original Bolt, but internally there are some major changes that I think are worthy of note. First off, brand new interior with shelving instead of actual closed off storage areas. That might feel like a weird choice, but it's actually very freeing for the interior. It opens the interior up and gives you more shelving to put things, especially if you're just jumping in and out of the car on a regular basis, you have kids, or you just need easy access to stuff and don't want to pull open a glove box and fumble about inside. It reminds me in many ways of a lot of cars from Europe in the 1990s. So think all of the Fiats and the Renaults of kind of the late 80s, early 90s. They all had these little cubby holes instead of discrete storage boxes or glove box covers. And that made the interior feel a little bit more airy. If you were someone who was drawn to clutter, it might not have been so good. But one of the things that GM is very eager to do with Bolt is to allow people who have them to design and make their own interior accessories for the car, i.e. GM's going to publish models of the center console area, which is very open and spacious and easily modifiable, including dividers that you can move around if you have particular cups you want to hold or anything else, and allow owners to design and print their own interior parts for the vehicle. In addition to all of that, you get USB-C throughout the vehicle, both front and rear, throughout all trim levels. In the RS, you get heated and cooled front seats, and I believe heated rear seats. And the LT, well, the LT you get fabric seats instead of this kind of leatherette feel. And I've got to say, I do prefer the seats in the LT. These ones are a little bit firmer. I think they're going to soften up with age, but they're not super comfortable. You also get up to 56.3 cubic feet of potential cargo carrying space. That's about 1,500 litres if you fold down the rear seats. You also get an under boot storage area in the rear. That's very familiar if you own an EUV because it's basically identical. And up front, of course, you also have wireless phone charging. Unlike some EVs that make wireless charging pockets, in Bolt, you actually get a shelf, which means if you have a larger phone, as I do, it's still capable of wireless charging. When GM invited us on this press launch, this drive event, we had a discussion in the office about whether we should bother coming. After all, we went to the official reveal event in October last year, and then at that event, GM was like, hey, this is going to be a limited production vehicle. And at the start of this year, we learned just how limited production this vehicle is going to be. GM has committed to only producing this car until the end of this year. And in a world where a new model is already being discontinued, is already being cancelled, there's a lot to be said for, well, why are we bothering? Why come out and review a car that is already going to be replaced or already going to be killed? But we decided it was worth coming for one reason. GM says it's going to make as many of these as it can between now and the end of production, and you'll be able to buy this for a year or two. And I'm very passionate about the original Bolt. I think it is by far the best car that GM has made in the EV space in the last 10 years. until this came along. GM's EV portfolio hasn't been my cup of tea of late. Large vehicles, not particularly engaging driving experiences, and the least said about the Chevrolet Silverado EV trail boss, the better. But there's something about this car that gives it a heart and a soul and a joy that has been absent for a couple of years now. This brings back the original, but it doesn't just bring back the original because everybody wanted GM to do that. It brought back the original, it took some of the lessons that GM had learned along the way, and then somehow infused it in a vehicle that feels more than the sum of its parts. Sure, I have some major bugbears with this vehicle. The fact that GM across its entire lineup opted to get rid of Android Auto and Apple CarPlay and instead forces you to use the Google infotainment system that's baked into every car. That means if you want to use it, you have to sign up and use a Google server. And some people have issues with that. Some people just want their data on their phone and nowhere else. And I'm among that group of people. That said, the infotainment system in this Bolt is by far improved on previous GM Android-only infotainment systems. It's quicker, it's more responsive, it allows you to get to your settings more quickly. I didn't feel any kind of baked-in rage with this that I have experienced with slower systems as found in the Hummer EV, for example, or the Equinox or the Blazer. They were all okay, but they all gave me irritations that over time would have made life with them a little irritating. Not so in this car. Let's not forget either that at this event, GM confirmed that every Bolt is going to come with a 360-degree dash cam as standard. It's not an optional extra. Every Bolt will have it. You just need to plug in a USB drive into the correct socket inside the vehicle, and then your USB drive will record 360-degree footage from around your vehicle, both while you're driving and also while you're parked. That's the kind of dashcam functionality that many EV owners have been begging mainstream automakers to offer for years. And normally that's the kind of thing that you only get when you have a high-end vehicle like a Tesla or a Rivian or maybe a Lucid. But no, this is standard on a vehicle with a starting price of under $30,000 US. That's incredible. The gear change. I'm not a fan of column shifts, but I could live with it in this car. The one thing that really irks me though is the removal of the physical light switch. It's something GM's been doing across its entire lineup. It's not exclusive to Bolt, and I wish that GM would bring back that physical switch. There are physical switches elsewhere in the car. It's got full physical switches for the mirrors, which means you can just jump in and get going with ease. It's got physical switches for the seat adjustment. By the way, the driver's seat in this particular model year of Bolt, it's all fully electronically adjustable with lumbar support. And you have 4 window switches, which again, bonus. And there's some logicality to the cabin layout that makes it feel familiar, that makes it feel safe. And for the first time in a really long time, I've got behind the wheel of a GM vehicle that doesn't feel too large. And for that, I have to give GM the praise that is due. I don't like the push towards subscription services. GM says it will give you 8 years of connectivity for free. Big whoop. But I want to know what happens after that. And GM is pledging that it's going to keep supporting this car. It's going to keep supporting its original car. Previous owners of Volt and Bolt might disagree about how practical that is on a daily basis. But the ball is now in GM's court. If it can stop dealers from price gouging, which we know they will for this car, if we can stop dealers from turning people away after this vehicle stops being made in a year or so's time because they don't want to work on a vehicle that's no longer made, big bonus for GM. But if dealers do what I think dealers will do, which was turn their noses up at these and refuse to work on them after they've stopped production, and make parts impossibly difficult to get, which, by the way, is not a GM thing, it's just an auto industry-wide thing, it could be very bad. If, on the other hand, GM fully embraces a vehicle that it's openly admitted is going to be killed off well before its time, and maybe rethinks that decision and keeps making it, it could not only win more customers, but it could become the dominant force in North America for small, fun, affordable electric cars. Nissan just cancelled the Leaf S in North America. The starting price of the entry-level Bolt is $3,000 cheaper than the starting price of the Nissan Leaf S Plus. And if you're struggling to pay rent, you're struggling to pay bills, but you need a new car, that's a lot of money to save. And for that reason, this test drive feels bittersweet. When we were invited on this launch event, I joked with the team about how we should maybe come up with a homage to Who Killed the Electric Car, where there was a fake funeral for the EV1 and mourners and everything at Hollywood Cemetery, right? And I was joking that I was going to buy a funeral flower arrangement to put on the hood of this car and walk out of shot. But I just can't do that because this car is still alive. It still lives, and it has the potential to live further if only the top brass at GM stop playing politics and start making cars that are so eminently drivable. GM said it itself this morning. Bolt is one of its biggest conquest cars. Its most important vehicles to getting people not only behind the wheel of an EV, but into a GM vehicle for the first time. It has a path to gain more customers. Well, this is 2026, where the rules are changed, where the law doesn't matter. I mean, habanero orange is not that far away from tangerine, right?